The storehouse smelled of dust, old wood, and the faint, sweet rot of damp straw, not the clean, golden scent of proper grain. Matilda stood just inside the doorway, letting her eyes adjust. Outside, the village slept, wrapped in the brittle hush of late autumn. The moon, thin as a sickle, cast long fingers of light through the cracks in the plank walls, striping the floor, striping the great grain sacks stacked against the far wall. 5 sacks. 5 full bushels of winter wheat, measured, sealed, and signed for by her own hand just that morning. 5 bushels meant porridge through December. 5 bushels meant children wouldn't cough themselves raw come January. She walked toward them, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. Her grey tunic, the one she'd mended 3 times at the elbows, brushed the tops of her straw-wrapped feet. She stopped before the first sack. Her fingers found the rough twine knot she'd tied herself hours ago. Her stomach clenched, not with hunger, though she hadn't eaten since noon, but with the thick, sour taste of almost. She'd told herself it was clever. She'd told herself it was mercy. The apothecary's words echoed in the quiet, foxglove, dried and powdered. Enough to steady a failing heart for 2 months. Price: 2 bushels. And I'll need it fresh before the frost locks the roads. 2 bushels. But she'd taken 5. Just in case, she'd thought. Just in case the first dose isn't enough. Just in case mother worsens. Just in case I need something else. Her fingers worked the knot loose. The sack side open, releasing a puff of fine, pale dust that caught the moonlight like smoke. She dipped her hand in. Cool, smooth wheat berries. Real. Life. She turned and grabbed the sack she'd hidden behind the door days ago, light, suspiciously light. She untied it. Inside, a mountain of pale chaff, brittle and hollow, and beneath it, a layer of fine river sand, cold and heavy. She'd spent hours mixing them, shaking the sack, testing the weight on the balance until it matched, until it lied perfectly. She began the swap. Scoop of wheat into her apron. Scoop of chaff and sand back into the village sack. Again. And again. The rhythm was hypnotic, awful. Her arms moved like someone else's. The chaff whispered as it fell. The sand hissed, a dry, secret sound. She didn't look at the growing pile of stolen wheat in her apron. She focused on the feel, the deceptive heft of the refilled sack, the way the pale mixture gleamed dully in the moonlight, almost like the real thing. Halfway through the 3rd sack, her hand slipped. A single wheat berry, plump and amber, rolled from her palm and landed on the dirt floor. She stared at it. A tiny, perfect thing. Life, stolen and dropped. She didn't pick it up. She just kept scooping. By the 5th sack, sweat slicked her temples despite the chill. Her braid had come loose at the crown, a few dark strands sticking to her neck. She tied the last sack shut, her fingers fumbling with the knot. It looked right. It had to look right. She gathered the stolen wheat, 5 heavy, honest bushels, and stuffed it into her own coarse sack. It felt like dragging a stone. She hid it beneath the loose floorboard near the door, the one only she knew about. Tomorrow, before first light, she'd take it to the road where the apothecary waited. She stepped back. 5 sacks stood in a row. 5 sacks of winter hope. 5 sacks of sand and lies. She wiped her hands on her grey tunic, leaving faint, dusty streaks. Then she walked out, closing the heavy door behind her. The iron latch clicked home, a small, final sound in the vast, watchful dark. She didn't look back. She walked toward her cottage, toward her mother's shallow, rattling breaths, her own heart hammering not with guilt, but with the fierce, trembling belief that she just bought them both a little more time. Just a little more. It was worth it. It had to be worth it. She didn't know, as she slipped into the house and knelt by her mother's pallet, pressing a cool cloth to the woman's fevered brow, that the baker, Thomas, was already awake. That he'd heard the storehouse latch click twice that night. That he'd seen her shadow, long and grey, moving against the moonlit wall. She didn't know that tomorrow's bread would crumble to dust in his hands. She didn't know about the Flaka. Not yet. For now, there was only the weight of the stolen grain beneath the floorboard, and the fragile, desperate warmth of her mother's hand in hers. Dawn came brittle and pale, frost feathering the thatch. Smoke curled thin from cottage chimneys, not the thick, hopeful plume of baking, but the weak sigh of warming hearths. Matilda stood at her window, watching Thomas the baker trudge toward the storehouse, his broad shoulders hunched against the cold. Her stomach twisted, not with hunger, but with the tight, coiled dread of waiting. She heard it first, a sound that didn't belong. Not the crackle of fire, not the lowing of the single village cow. A crunch. Dry. Wrong. Then Thomas's voice, sharp as shattered pottery, cut through the morning hush, God's teeth. She was out the door before she thought, her bare feet flinching on the frozen mud. The square was already gathering, women with empty baskets, men with tools half raised, children clinging to skirts, eyes wide. They stood in a loose, silent half-circle around Thomas, who knelt by the open storehouse door, his huge hands cradling something terrible. He held up a loaf. It wasn't brown. It wasn't golden. It was a sickly, ashen grey, cracked like old plaster. As Matilda pushed to the front, heart slamming against her ribs, Thomas squeezed it. It didn't yield. It shattered. A dozen fragments of gritty dust fell onto the frozen earth. A little boy, Ellis, whose cough had kept the whole lane awake all summer, reached out, curious. Thomas broke off a smaller piece, handed it to him. "Try, lad. Just a bite." Ellis popped it in. Chewed once. Twice. His face crumpled. He gagged, a harsh, wet sound, and spat. Into his palm, mixed with saliva, lay a smear of grey sludge and tiny, unmistakable grains of sand. A murmur rose, low and dangerous, like stones grinding together. Then Agnes, the miller's wife, snatched another loaf from Thomas's basket, broke it open. More dust. More grit. She rubbed a pinch between thumb and forefinger. Her eyes, hard as flint, locked onto Matilda's. She knew. Everyone knew the grain had been Matilda's charge. Her signature was on the storehouse log, ink still faintly damp. Elder Godwin arrived then, his brown robe pulled tight, his iron ring glinting in the weak sun. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He walked straight to the storehouse, Matilda's logbook in his hand. He flipped to yesterday's entry, her careful script, the tally marks for 5 bushels received, sealed. He ran a thick, calloused finger down the page, stopping where the ink blurred slightly near the bottom corner. He sniffed it. Then he dipped his finger into the broken loaf Ellis had spat out, rubbed the grit on his thumb, and pressed it to the smudge on the page. The grit stuck. A perfect match. He looked up, his gaze finding Matilda in the crowd. Not angry. Worse. Disappointed. A look that said the village hadn't just been cheated. It had been betrayed. By one of its own. By the sharp girl in the grey tunic who could read the steward's marks. Matilda, daughter of Agnes, Godwin's voice was quiet, carrying like ice on water. "Come here." Her legs moved. She felt the eyes, Ellis's confused stare, Thomas's fury, her own mother's dawning horror from the cottage doorway, one hand pressed flat against the doorframe. She stopped before Godwin. The cold seeped up through the soles of her feet, sharp as needles. He held up the logbook, the smudged page facing her. "Explain the sand," he said. "Just that." 3 words. The lie died in her throat, choked by the sight of Ellis wiping his gritty mouth with the back of his hand, his small chest hitching with another dry cough. The weight of the stolen grain beneath the floorboard suddenly felt like a tombstone pressing down on her chest. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out but a shaky breath, frosting in the air. Godwin closed the book. The sound was final. "Bring the Flaka," he said. And the name, spoken aloud in the frozen square, made the murmurs stop dead. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The grey tunic felt suddenly thin. Too thin. The Flaka came on a cart pulled by 2 silent men, its oak frame stark against the winter sky. It wasn't ornate, just heavy, scarred timber and cold iron. But the villagers recoiled as if it radiated frost. Whispers slithered through the crowd, "Haven't seen it since old Jorik salted the ale. They say the wood drinks shame." Godwin didn't give a speech. He simply pointed to the grinding stone beside the well, rough, pitted granite, stained dark with old spills. "Kneel." Matilda's legs folded. The stone bit into her knees, sharp and unforgiving through the thin wool of her tunic. Her braid, already loose, was gently but firmly unpinned by old Marta, the mender, her fingers surprisingly tender as the dark hair fell around her shoulders. "Shame must be bare, child," Marta murmured, so low only Matilda heard. "The hair, the truth, all of it." Then the cuffs. Cold iron snapped around her wrists, locking them high on the Flaka's crossbar. Her arms were wrenched up, shoulders screaming. Before she could brace, the first sack came, a coarse hemp bag, heavy and damp, slung over her head, the rope biting into her neck. Chaff and sand. It settled heavily on her collarbones, a mocking weight. Thump. A second sack over her left shoulder. Thump. A third over her right. Each one pulled her down, forcing her spine to curve, her forehead to press against the rough oak post. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps now, fogging the wood before her eyes. Then the worst, 2 smaller sacks, tied directly to the iron cuffs on her wrists. They hung like obscene fruit, dragging her arms lower, stretching the muscles until fire lanced from her shoulders to her fingertips. She couldn't lift her head. Couldn't wipe the grit already trickling from the neck sack into the corner of her eye. It stung. She blinked, tears mixing with the dust on her cheeks. Silence. Thick, heavy, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of meltwater from the well's stone rim and the ragged sound of her own breathing. She felt every gaze, Thomas's fury, Ellis's bewildered fear, the women's hard judgment. She felt the weight of every stolen bushel, every lie, every moment she'd told herself just this once. The sand in the sacks shifted, a dry, whispering accusation against her skin. Then, footsteps. Slow. Familiar. Her mother. Agnes stopped before her. Matilda squeezed her eyes shut, unable to face her. She felt her mother's presence, smelled the faint lavender she always tucked into her shawl, a scent of home, of safety, now impossibly distant. She braced for a touch, a word of defense. Instead, she heard the soft shush of cloth. Felt a small, lighter weight settle at her knees on the stone. Not on her. Before her. She forced her head up, just enough. At her feet lay a 6th sack. Not hemp. Linen, worn soft. And it wasn't filled with sand. It was filled with ash, the fine, grey powder from their own hearth, where her mother had burned the last of the useless foxglove tincture that morning. The tincture bought with stolen grain. The tincture that hadn't worked. That couldn't work, not against a heart broken by grief and cold. Agnes's voice, when it came, was stripped bare, quieter than the dripping well, yet it cut through the square like a knife. "You stole grain, Matilda. But this is what you stole from me. My hope. my trust. My belief that my daughter was better than hunger. The words didn't just land. They shattered something deep inside Matilda. A sob ripped from her throat, raw and ugly, tearing free not from the weight on her arms, but from the unbearable, crushing weight of that ash at her knees. Her mother turned and walked away, not in anger, but in a grief so profound it left no room for anything else. The sun climbed. The sand in the sacks bled onto her grey tunic, her hair, her skin. She knelt. She breathed. She bore the weight. And for the first time, the grain she'd stolen felt like the least of what she'd lost. At sunset, Godwin unlocked the cuffs. Matilda collapsed forward, catching herself on raw, bleeding palms on the grinding stone. She didn't rise. She crawled, not toward home, but toward the granary steps. There, in the gathering dusk, voice hoarse as gravel, she confessed everything. Not just the theft, but the arrogance. I thought I was the only one who saw the edge, the only one willing to jump. She offered her thin blanket, her mother's spare shawl, her own winter cloak, to Thomas's family, to Ellis. The punishment ended. The shame didn't. Winter came, brutal and deep. Matilda's penance was grinding grain, barefoot on that same stone, hour after hour, sack after sack. Her hands grew thick with calluses, her knees permanently bruised. Weeks later, Ellis, cheeks less hollow, pushed a chipped wooden bowl of thin, grey porridge toward her as she worked. He didn't speak. Just pointed to the spoon in the bowl. 2 portions. He scooped one out, held it out to her. Matilda looked at the offering, at the boy she'd nearly poisoned, at the village she'd betrayed, at her mother watching from the cottage door, her face unreadable. She took the spoon. The porridge was gritty, real, honest. And as the first warm, imperfect mouthful touched her tongue, the tears came, not for the pain, but for the unbearable, fragile weight of a mercy she hadn't earned. Her grey tunic, washed and mended, still held faint, stubborn smudges of sand at the hem. A reminder. Not of what she'd done, but of what, slowly, painfully, she might yet learn to be.